Lesson 3-4, the Quadratic Formula, Part 1. So we're going to talk about general rules for solving any quadratic equation. The first thing you always want to do is you always want to set it equal to 0. You want to set it equal to 0 first. Always, always, always. Then, once it's set equal to 0, you decide if you want to factor. And if you want to factor, you can solve it by factoring. If you have a perfect square trinomial, you can try to solve this by completing the square, but I don't know if you want to necessarily do that all the time. If you have it in the form something squared, you can solve using square roots. But if all else fails, we're going to use the quadratic formula. And if you remember, the quadratic formula is x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I suggest you memorize this, write this down. There's a nice little song. Go ahead, look that up. There's a song for how you can memorize the quadratic formula, but you've got to have that memorized. Absolutely 100% memorized. Now, it will always work. The quadratic formula always works. Let me show you with the problem here. So x squared plus 3x equals 5. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure it's set equal to 0. If it's not set equal to 0, you can't use the quadratic formula. Next, you want to identify a. So a is equal to 1. That's the number that's right here in front of the x squared term. That's a. b. b is going to be the number that's in front of x. So in this particular case, b is equal to positive 3. And c is going to be the number here that's at the end. So c is equal to negative 5. Now, it's just a matter of plugging in the values into my quadratic formula. So x is equal to the opposite of b, the opposite of 3, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 3 squared, minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. All right, so now we just simplify things down. So x is equal to the opposite of 3 plus or minus, let's see here, 3 squared is 9. 4 times 1 is 4 times negative 5 is negative 20. So it's a minus negative 20. So minus negative 20 all over 2. Now, I will go ahead and do that math in there. So 9 minus negative 20 is the same as adding 20. So 3 square, that'll give me the square root of 29 there. And my answer is negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 29. This gives me two crazy decimal answers, but that's okay. The correct answer, or the answer is negative 3 plus the square root of 29 over 2, and negative 3 minus the square root of 29 over 2. If I pull out my handy dandy calculator, that is approximately, and I say approximately because it's not exactly those values, 1.193 and negative 4.193. Not bad. It will always work. So even when we get a problem that looks like this, okay, first thing, set it equal to 0. So we'll subtract our 13x from both sides, and we will add our 16 to both sides. So let's see here. That will give me the equation 4x squared minus 10x plus 16 equals, those cancel, 0. Now, quadratic formula, let's go. So we'll identify A. A is 4. B is negative 10. And C is 16. So x is equal to the opposite of negative 10, so positive 10, plus or minus the square root of negative 10 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. All right, so let's hear. That's 10 plus or minus the square root of negative 10 squared. Be careful, that's negative 10 times negative 10. If you're not careful in your calculator, you'll get a negative sign, so please be careful with that. Put the negative in the parentheses. Negative 10 parentheses, then square it. Let's see here. 4 times 16. Let's see here. That's 256. So minus 256 all over 8. Okay, so x equals 10 plus or minus the square root of 100 minus 256. That gives me negative 156 over 8. Ooh, that's a little bit of a problem. So let's come over here. So the square root of negative 156. 156, let me see here. What's the biggest perfect square that I can divide into 156? Well, after some trial and error, it's 4. So that's 4 times 39. I did some trial and error there, folks. So I did the work while I paused the video here. So let's see, the square root of 4 is 2. I have this negative 1, so that's I, and then I have square. So this simplifies down to 2I times the square root of 39. Okay, back to the problem. So let's see here. So that gives me x equals 10 plus or minus 2I times the square root of 39 all over 8. Now, the one last thing that I want to make sure I do is I want to make sure my fraction is simplified. If I look here, here, and here, I notice that all 4 of those numbers are divisible by 2. So I'm going to divide those numbers by 2. Sorry, I don't know. I want to make sure that that's highlighted for you so that you see it. And I get x equals, that's here, 10 divided by 2 is 5, plus or minus that 2, that turns into 1. So I square roots of 39 over 4. That is the final answer to this problem. Right now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pause the video. I'd like you to try to do the quadratic formula with these 3 problems, and then we'll go over the answers here momentarily. So again, that quadratic formula, x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Say it about 100 times so that you memorize it. Okay, number 1, first things first, make sure it's set equal to 0. So I'll add 4 to both sides. X squared minus 6x plus 4 equals 0. Next, we apply the quadratic formula, so I'll identify a, b, and c, and I'll plug them into the formula. The opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So that's here, that's 6 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 16 over 2, which is 6 plus or minus the square root of 20 over 2. I'll simplify the radical, the square root of 20. That is 2 square roots of 5 over 2. Simplify down my radical, or my fraction, because again, 6, 2, and 2 are all divisible by 2. So I'll get 3 plus or minus the square root of 5. Boom. Number 2, same idea. I'll subtract x, I'll subtract 8. X squared minus x minus 8 equals 0. I'll identify a, b, and c. I know that x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. That's here, so that's x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of, let's say, 4 times 5, so it's 1 plus 160 over 10. So I got 1 plus or minus the square root of 161 over 10. And I don't believe there's any perfect square that can divide into 161. So my final answer is 1 plus or minus the square root of 161 over 10. Number 3, this one's already set equal to 0. So, okay, so we just identify a, b, and c. And I see that x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. That gives me x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 36. 3 times 3 is 9 minus 36 over 6. So here, 36 minus 36 is 0. So negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 6, and the square root of 0 is in fact 0. So I have negative 6 over 6, which equals 1. Okay, folks, so that's it for the quadratic formula. Try those practice homework problems. If you have any questions, please let me know. Good luck.